I'm Ben Myers with Ask4TR, located at www.ask4tr.com. Joining us today is Andre Koen, who is a racial justice advocate and a professor at a local graduate school. Thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
So let me ask you this. What exactly is a racial justice advocate?
Yeah, so when we talk about this idea of what racial justice is, it really is about focusing all of our efforts on what the law says should be applied to all so-called racial groups. And so when we talk about that, we also indicate things or things that are implied are things like affirmative action, all the civil rights accomplishments of the 1960s, or that should be applied to so-called minority groups. We want to make sure that those things consistently happen.
So specifically, how do you fit into that particular conversation?
So, very interesting that when we talk about this idea of being a racial justice advocate, oftentimes we start off with conversations around diversity,
right,
or sensitivity training, and what we've learned is that those things have a shelf life of about 5 to 10 years, but they oftentimes don't get to the core of what typically is ailing us. And so when we talk about this idea of a racial justice advocate, what we're doing is we're pairing all of those touchy-feely pieces with the consequences and the responsibilities of the law. And so that's where we start to get the idea of critical race theory,
okay,
which is this justice movement that's really based on the law, its promises, and the responsibilities of organizations to make sure that people have access to what the law says they should have access to.
So let me ask you this. You talked about promises that the law makes. What kind of promises does the law make that seems to be silent to issues regarding race?
Yeah, so, if we go back to either the preamble to the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence,
right,
we have these conversations about all men being created equal,
right,
that they have inalienable rights, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are these grand promises that this country has made to all of its residents. And what we're finding is that some of those promises, just like Dr. King said, we're cashing the check, but it's coming back bankrupt,
right,
or that the check is being bounced because the account hasn't been set up for all of us. And so when we hear of racial profiling, what we know is that racial profiling is a good tool, but when it's the only tool that's used for community policing, it's a problem, mm-hmm, because there are more tools that are available to officers.
So let me ask you this. So looking back at the founding of this country, you look at the 4th of July, 1776. So the idea that this country said, you know what, this is our Independence Day. We're going to be free from the tyranny of a foreign government. We're going to declare ourselves independent. This is the United States of America. We have a small number of colonies that have joined up. They're all states now. But when you look at that in connection with the idea of all men are created equal, and you look at the timeline, you look at 1776 and that statement, is it not concerning to you that when that statement is made, there are still men in this country who are not deemed to be equal to the same people who are saying all men are being created equal, or should be treated equal?
Yeah, but we have to be, so it is unfair for us to look at the past through our current lenses, right? So to the best of, I believe that the Founding Fathers, with the best that they had, tried to produce a world, given their lenses, that was cutting edge. It was the top of their technology,
sure,
right?
Sure.
And so for us to look back at them and look at all of the faults is disingenuous on our part, because they could not have seen a future where Black people and white people were together, Native Americans were participating in a culture. However, for us to blame people for not living up to those things is also problematic, right?
Well, let me ask you this. So here's my concern. You have, in 1776, you have this idea that people will be created equal.
Yeah.
But then not for almost 100 years after that is the passing of the 13th Amendment, which specifically says slavery shall be abolished unless
an exception.
There is an exception. And that's what I find intriguing about the 13th Amendment. What is that exception?
Yeah, well, the 13th Amendment is actually a Trojan horse, particularly for black people, right? Because and I do this in one of my sessions, right? So I ask people in my sessions, I want you to look up two terms. One, white codes. The second term I ask them to look up is black codes.
Right.
Now, you can use whatever search engine you want, or look at any media source that you want, but you won't find these things called white codes.
Right.
But you will find black codes. And what the 13th Amendment did as a Trojan horse, it made it illegal. It made it to be a crime to be black. And so one of the things we, just stepping back to our founding fathers, we recognize that there has always been a duality in America. We've always had this two-sided relationship, even with ourselves. We were born as a house divided. And what I mean by that is, while they are framing this Constitution, while they're talking about this Declaration of Independence, they are also participating in the economic system called slavery. And so whether they were good slave masters or not, they still participated in that system.
But I guess here's my thing, though. So you look at the 13th Amendment as being a Trojan horse, but your statement is it makes being black illegal.
Yes.
I look at it a slightly different way. I look at the 13th Amendment, and it makes people think that the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but it doesn't actually do that. What it says is it abolishes slavery unless you have the right to due process, and due process finds that you should be enslaved. So, and we'll put up here in a second an actual articulation of the 13th Amendment. But at the end of the day, slavery was not necessarily abolished from the perspective that I see the 13th Amendment. It was simply said, we're not going to enslave anybody unless due process occurs and that person is deemed to need to be placed back in slavery, which lends itself to the current prison situation, or the current prison process.
Yeah. So I can buy that argument to a certain degree, right?
And what degree is that?
So I can buy that argument until we start looking at the data that shows us what. So in this as well as anyone, that the law particularly does not look at the intent, but it looks at the impact of actions. Right. And so when we,
I think it looks at both. I think when people craft laws, you look at the intent of what they're trying to craft that law to either uphold or to restrict, and then they hopefully will see what the actual impact is after it's been implemented. So,
however, sexual harassment is one of those situations where the intent is not a major part of the decisions that get made around remediation or what should happen to an individual, right? So impact oftentimes is a lot larger than intent. Although I would submit to you that that intent is extremely important. But one of the things that we have to look at is that, particularly for African Americans, we make up roughly around 13% of the population, give or take.
Sure.
And of that 13%, African American males make 6% of that particular population. So now when we look at the overall population, it is surprising and alarming to me that in any particular indicator that you want to look at, that a 6% of the population makes up 40% of every negative indicator on social health and welfare. Right. That is alarming. So when I say that the 13th Amendment was a Trojan horse, particularly for black people and black men, though the impact of that 13th Amendment is what I look at. And so when they made these exceptions, except when a person is convicted of a crime, well, if we look at the black codes did specifically target behaviors, attitudes, neighborhoods where black people lived. The South, if we look at Louisiana, we look at Mississippi, we look at Alabama, we start to see those codes. And then when we move to the North, we see other things that are just shifts on the same old kind of conversations, right? So this idea of lurking.
Right.
I can get a ticket for lurking, or I can get a ticket for the intent to lurk.
Yep.
Right.
And you get lurking, intent to lurk, loitering, things that on the face of it, yeah, it makes sense. You don't want somebody hanging around a store looking in, peeping in with an idea that they may rob it, but that's not the impact. The impact of these kind of codes or these kind of laws is to allow law enforcement or to allow other people or just individuals to say, well, I don't like what he's doing, so I'm going to stop him, investigate, figure out what he's doing here, and I'm going to give him a ticket for lurking or loitering, which spins us completely out of control because now you have a ticket for, in Minnesota, it's a misdemeanor.
Yep.
So you have that misdemeanor. Now you got to go to court. When you go to court, you stand in line, you're waiting around to hear or be seen by a judge or a prosecutor, and it just goes starkly downhill from there. And then especially if you ignore the summons or ignore the ticket and they cite you, and maybe you have a driver's license or you don't have a driver's license, what happens then?
Yeah, I think it's funny. So what we know in the juvenile justice system, they had a practice that even parents would say is a practice that doesn't make sense.
Right.
And so they would cite kids for violations of curfew or whatever and give the citation to the kid.
Yeah.
And so now if I'm a kid and I'm in trouble, am I going to give that citation to my parent? No.
Why would I do that?
No, why would I do that, right? So now kids are getting warrants, bench warrants, for not participating in the justice system. And yes, they may have been wrong for doing those things, but it hasn't been until recently, particularly in Hennepin County, where they said, you know what, let's do things differently.
Yeah.
Let's start calling the parents of the kids that we're giving citations to. Let's start mailing these citations home so that parents can be accountable for what their kids are doing. And for any kind of justice to really happen, we have to start looking at alternative approaches to doing what we used to just do.
Right.
And until we're able to do that, we're not going to turn this tide. I mean, I think it's deplorable, and it upsets me that other people aren't as upset that 6% of a population makes up 40% of all negative indicators, and nobody seems to be upset about that.
Let me ask you something. Why don't you think people are upset? Because to me, when I look at the data, being in court a lot, seeing the people that are in that courthouse, seeing the people that are in the courtroom, seeing the people that are congregating outside of the courtroom waiting to go in, those people are for the most part African American. If they're not African American men or women, they're mainly African American men. Mm-hmm. Why does that not upset America from your perspective?
So do you really want to know?
I do. I wouldn't have you on the show if I didn't want to know.
So the core question that we have to answer is there something genetically wrong with Black people that they can't do what everyone else is doing?
And we'll be right back with Ask for TR here with Andre Koen.
For the record, proof to show the truth.
And we're back with Andre Koen, a racial justice advocate. During our last segment, Mr. Koen introduced a very interesting question. What was that question, Andre?
So basically the question was, is there something inherently wrong with Black people that does not allow them to be successful on all sorts of health and wellness indicators?
And what's the answer to that question?
So the answer, well, I don't necessarily have the answer, but we can, if we look at the question, the answers that we come up with independently will shed some light on where we are and where things are currently.
So then let's answer your question in the negative. Let's say that there's absolutely nothing wrong with African Americans. How does that answer equate in your question?
Yep. So I'm going to spin it on the other side, right? So I'm going to talk about the positive. So if there is something wrong with African Americans,
okay.
If there is something wrong with African Americans that they can't either compete, they can't learn, they can't participate in our society the way the rest of or the majority of society is, then we have to look at everything that they do as a deficit, right? Okay. So we have to look at them as people who need our help. People who need our assistance, people who are, and actually we should actually ask scientists to come up with medication to help the genetics of Black people if that is the case.
So then essentially you're arguing that the majority of society, white people, they're the norm. And then you look at Black people with that same question, which is there something wrong or inherently wrong with them? If you say yes, there is something inherently wrong, then we need to introduce something into that lifestyle in order to make them or get them to a position of equality with the majority.
Not only just the lifestyle, but their genetics. That there's something in their genetics if we say yes to that question.
But the reality is, a black person standing next to a white person, the only distinction overtly is the complexion of their skin. Internally, their blood, the blood that pumps through their veins, the molecules that make up their genetic code, all of that is the same.
And I agree with you. However, it is very clear that there are systems and people who don't agree with that, because they treat black people as if they consistently need additional services and help.
Like what? Give me an example of that.
So, for example, I would.
So I guess my issue is this. I look at the way the system is set up. I look at what I see in court every day. I see the disparity. I see the increase of African Americans, even though black people in generality are a smaller population or a smaller segment of our population.
Yeah.
But you see that they are much more impacted by the legal process,
Yeah.
much more impacted by whether it's crime or whether it's an eviction or housing or whatever it may be. You see that impact. And for me, the question is, why?
Okay,
When we are the same.
Yep. So herein lies the second part, or the other answer to that question. So if there is nothing genetically wrong with black people,
Right.
if it's not inherent, if it's not innate in black people, then the only other answer to that question, or the only answer that we can really come out of, is that it is the systems and the environments in which black people are being subjected to that is leading to these negative outcomes, these negative life outcomes.
So let me turn back a little bit. We talked in the first segment the idea of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the idea that this system in and of itself, the foundation of where we're living now. My question to you is this: if we had a system that was generated that did not have African Americans free, and didn't have us free until 100 years after that, is it possible that the very system that we are having to succumb to never envisioned us as part of that citizenry, part of that system?
Yeah, no, it's obvious that it never envisioned us as being a part of that system.
So if it didn't envision us as being part of that system, is it fair for the system that subjects us to its system, its process? And I guess what I'm saying is, so you have a judicial system and an executive branch. The executive branch targets African Americans on a much higher rate than other people, allowing for the disproportionality in our prison systems.
Yep.
Is it fair to subject that particular populace to the same standards and norms that really never envisioned us being part of it?
Yeah, well, I mean, you answered your own question with the demonstration of the question itself, right?
I do that a lot, but
but it's very clear that it's not fair to do that, right? It's not fair to hold people accountable to unfair standards. One of the things that I did as a high school classroom teacher was that I taught my students middle class values. And why was I teaching my urban, working class, and oftentimes lower class students white middle class values? So they can have some choices on how they want to interact in the world, right? So middle class values: buy a house, get married at a relatively young age, get 2.5 kids, a Labrador Retriever, white picket fence, all of those things.
Settle down in the suburbs.
Settle down in the suburbs. I taught those things to my students so they could have some choices. One of the things that we're not doing, particularly with African Americans, is that we're telling African Americans you can be anything you want to be, without the caveat that there are some systems that you may have to overcome, there's some work that you're going to have to put in, and that there's some accountabilities and sacrifices that you will have to make so that your next generation will be better off than you are. What kids are being sold is YOLO, you only live once. I got to get mine for now. I have to engage in these very self-defeating and limiting possibilities where getting an education is not cool. You are lame if you can read. So these kinds of things cultivate an environment where we have these discrepancies in the judicial process.
So let me ask you this. So what should we be telling people when it comes to raising kids, when it comes to being an adult, when it comes to all these choices that African Americans are going to have to make one way or the other. What should we be telling them at the very beginning of the process? So they come out, they're introduced to the world, they hit the ages of 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. What is it that we should be telling them, hey, this is how you make it in a system that was not designed to care about you?
Yeah. So first of all, we have to tell them what the house rules are. And so the house rules are the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and every African American child, every so-called minority child should have access to those documents at their fingertips. They should be read to them like bedtime stories, or so that becomes a part of their character, and they know those things. So when those things are violated, they have something to point to. Now, I would also suggest that as communities, that we familiarize ourselves with those great and sacred documents, so that we can hold folks accountable to those things. We also need to tell the truth about the founding and the greatness of America, right? So there's this mythos that only white people have created the greatness of this fine country,
right,
when in fact we have to tell the truth, A, about whiteness, and two, about the greatness of our country. So in the 50s and 60s, there was this notion that America made great cars. We have the muscle cars. We have Corvettes and Mustangs from '65 to the late '60s, and that was the prime of automotive ingenuity. That Ford and Detroit were a growing and booming economy.
Right.
Well, there's another side to that story that we haven't told, which is also the truth. And the truth is, why was GM and Ford and Chrysler, why were they booming economies? Because they didn't have any competition.
Mm-hmm. Right.
When we start to see in the 80s and in the 90s that Ford and GM and Chrysler have to compete with BMW, Volkswagen, Honda, Toyota, what we start to see is that they weren't as great as we always said they were.
Not as great as we thought we were.
Right. And why is that? Why were those cars not as great as we thought they were? Because now they have competition. In the 50s, 60s, and even the 70s, what was Germany doing? What was Japan doing? They weren't making cars. Mm-hmm. They were building their infrastructure. So they didn't have time to build cars to compete with Americans. So a lot of times when we talk about this American superiority, what we're not talking about is the backdrop that has been produced to allow that illusion to take place.
So essentially, we're not talking about American inferiority.
No,
we're operating in an extraordinarily small pond, and we're the huge fish, not realizing that just down the street is an extraordinarily large ocean with a whole bunch of whales. And we're killing off the whales so that our pond we can still look like the big fish, right? So looking at all of that and understanding that there's a system that's created not for us, that everything around us as African Americans is defeatist. Where's the hope? Where's the drive to move forward, to be better? Why even try when you know that the system that is created, that you have to subject yourself to, that never envisioned you? Why even try?
So this is where the hope comes in, right? And the hope simply is that we start to recognize that not only was the system not necessarily built for folks who look like us, the system also wasn't built for women. The system also wasn't built for poor white people, because poor white people get treated very much like other so-called minority groups, right?
So poor whites are just the same as black people
in a number of such situations and circumstances. I would agree with that, right? And so what we know is that anything that is created by human beings can be changed, can be altered, can be made better. And so the hope comes in understanding what the house rules are, playing by the house rules, but also introducing some new things into the game that maybe the original game makers didn't think about. And so the hope comes in that as we move through these obstacles, that difficulties actually make us stronger. I don't get strength by lifting lesser weights. I get strength by increasing the amount of weights that I lift. And so the same thing can be said for these small obstacles. I believe that African Americans and Native Americans specifically are able and willing to overcome that 101-year gap between the freeing of the slaves and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? That 101-year gap, we can overcome that gap. And that our white brothers and sisters who have had that head start will certainly recognize as that gap shortens, because then we'll start to empower each other. And one of the things that we also have to recognize is that when folks have been in power, equality feels like oppression.
Right.
Right?
To them?
To them.
Okay.
So when folks who have been in power start to see equality, just the movement of equality feels like oppression. And that's where we get misnomers like reverse discrimination.
Right. Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's where that hope lies.
The idea of white lives matter, or the idea of, well, affirmative action is a process that discriminates me as a white person.
Yeah. And we know that that's not true, right? So, and we know that's not true just by looking at the numbers. If we take affirmative action, for example, if you ask someone on the street, what percentage would you reserve as a quota, which we know quotas are illegal and they're not a part of the affirmative action, but most laymen would talk about affirmative action in terms of quotas. Most people would suggest that if an employer was going to have a quota, that they would use a number like 10% or 20%, but certainly not 50% or 75% as a holdback.
Just as a gap
Just
to
as a
fill
gap to fill, right?
with minorities, so that they can say, well, I've done my affirmative action part. I've added these individuals, and I'm not a racist.
Yep.
Essentially, is what it comes down to.
Yep. And so what we understand is in that process, to tell the truth, when people are competing in those affirmative action programs or against those affirmative action programs, what's really happening is people are competing against the majority and not the minority.
Right.
And so when people can't compete against the majority, they blame the minority for their inability to compete. And so,
I'll tell you, and we're going to break here in a second, but I'll tell you what concerns me is that all of this stuff seems to be multi-directional. You have issues of whether or not the system is built for African Americans, and the very system that is not built for African Americans results in African Americans having to conform and having to do all these other things in order to adjust themselves so that they can go back and say, okay, well, I want to operate in this system that I haven't been told the rules about, but I'm going to do all this stuff, and then we have kids coming out of that process. It's a lot.
it is.
It's a lot, and what concerns me is at some point in time, it feels like there's going to be an awakening or a conversation that has to happen of, why is this so unfair when I look at you, you look exactly like me, except I have a tan and you don't. I think differently, not because I'm geared biologically to think differently, but because I have had to think differently to conform to a system that never envisioned me as being part of it.
Yeah.
And it seems like at some point in time, you stop and say, is it fair?
Well, here's the thing. We know that life is not fair, right?
Well,
and the conversations that are being had right now are exactly that. People aren't they're not asking the question. They're saying it's not fair, and I want what is fair and just. I want to be able to drive down the street in whatever car I have and not be judged whether my nose is wide enough to fit a description of a criminal.
And you're talking about the Flannery Steele situation.
I am talking about that, right? So people want to be able to operate and walk around the world without a constant police fear or present, whether it is a perceived or as a reality. People are saying, I'm tired of this. White people are saying that. Black people are saying that. Asian people are saying that. And so what we're coming to is a very summit of so-called marginalized people recognizing that the system doesn't work, that the system is trying to dehumanize us, and no matter what the system does, I am always human. And so once we start recognizing that, we can stand up and say, these are the things that are just, not just for me and mine, but for other people. And I'm looking towards my brothers and sisters so that we can build that hope. The only way that we're going to build a society that is egalitarian is by building a society that is egalitarian.
Our guest today is Andre Koen, and we'll be right back.
For the record, proof to show the truth.
And we're back. Our guest today with Ask4TR is Andre Koen, who is a racial justice advocate. Thank you again for coming, Andre. We do appreciate it.
No, I really enjoy being here.
So now let me ask you this. Our last segment was talking about systems and the fact that our Constitution, the construct of this country, really did not envision African Americans as part of its infrastructure the way it is now. Where do we go from there?
Yeah. So first of all, we're here.
Right. And I don't think we're going. It doesn't sound like going anywhere.
We're not going anywhere, right? I mean, we are and it's interesting that the contributions that we've made to this country as well as to the world are so profound. I mean, right. If you just look at sports, or you look at entertainment, or you look at sciences, we've really contributed a great deal to this great country, and so we're not going anywhere. With that in mind, we also have to recognize and help systems recognize that we're not going anywhere.
Right,
so,
right.
If we look at the Capitol, Benjamin Banneker's architecture of our Capitol, we recognize that we're not going anywhere. If we look at the fashion and we look at music and all those things, we recognize that we're not going anywhere. And so as folks who weren't originally envisioned as being a part of this process, being here, we have to take the responsibility of understanding the as I mentioned before, the house rules.
Right.
And so so we have to understand how the game is played and what goes on behind the scenes and how we can be a part of that.
Now, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
With that being said, do you think that we in this current generation, I guess they call them Generation Zs or post-millennials, do you think that they understand the rules or the house rules, as you put it?
Yeah, I don't think that they do understand kind of the house rules. However, they can understand the house rules.
Okay.
One of the things that I think we failed to do is to teach our young people what they need to know to be successful in society. And so part of that is recognizing all of their history, right? So, whether I'm Scandinavian, whether I'm Irish, whether I'm African American, whether I'm African,
right.
Knowing where I come from really gives me a good handle on who I am and who I can be. And so the current racial construct, we also have to recognize that race in and of itself is a governmental tool used to organize people in a particular kind of way.
Sure.
Race as it shows up in the United States is vastly different than how it shows up in Canada, which is actually vastly different than how it shows up in Brazil, South Africa,
anywhere
Japan,
outside of the bubble of the U.S.
Right. So race changes based on the governments that organize to do that. And so with that recognition, we have to hold on to our past and move forward. The notion of a melting pot is a faulty way to think about ourselves, because in that original poem, in that original play, The Melting Pot, the idea was that European ethnics would be boiled down into one particular race.
And that's usually identified as the white race.
As the white race. It became the default kind of race. And so when we talk about what the future holds, so we have to teach our young people history about themselves, their greatness, and continually have that as not just a 28-day study, but a year-long process. And not only African Americans, but Native American history has to be a part of the compulsory education system. Authentic white history, not just history of the United States conquerors, but those groups that have, like the Irish, who have been marginalized as a part of the system. As we teach those things moving forward, our young people can have a better chance to make better choices given what they know about themselves and about other people.
But now, looking at the fact that history is so important, and understanding that millennials, post-millennials, don't seem to, at this point, appreciate their history as much as baby boomers or even Generation Xers. Knowing that there is a lack of appreciation of that history, does it surprise you that we've had so many incidents with racial violence in this country?
No, it's not. It's not a surprise. Mostly because if I don't, so the military encourages or discourages fraternizing with the enemy.
Right.
Right. And so the basic premise is the less I know about someone, the more likely I am to be able to do my duty. And in that particular, using that particular metaphor, typically my duty has something to do with killing someone. Right. Right.
Well, if you can dehumanize
if
the
I can
enemy,
dehumanize,
it's not like I'm killing another human being.
Right.
I've dehumanized them to such a degree that they're not human. So me killing them or hurting them, it's not the same as hurting my brethren. It's somebody lesser than me.
Yeah. And so that's where, words like thug come in, right? So, most people don't even know that thugs were a part of a religious cult that would hide within groups and then murder that group for larceny, and then give all of their the things, the loot, if you will, as a sacrifice to a god. And so when you call someone a thug, not only are you saying that they're acting in a particular kind of way, but you're also inferring that they're devil worshippers. And so concepts like that, concepts like a beast, when our young people refer to themselves as being beasts, we oftentimes don't recognize the power that words have, and why a beast. I remember in our family legends and our family stories, there are stories about my great grandfather being a great gambler, and his street name was Doc, and he was called Doctor because the doctor was the best person in the community. And I remember in the 90s, growing up, we would call each other pimp. That's pimp. I want to pimp my ride. I want to do all these things. I
remember. Many moons ago, but I remember.
Yeah, and why did we do that? Because pimps were the most active members in the community. They were the symbol of success in the community. And so it hurts me and it scares me that now kids are calling each other beasts because... Then my question is that the best that you see in your community? Because doctors and lawyers and oftentimes teachers have moved to suburban areas or even rural areas and commute in, as opposed to being a part of the community in which they serve. And so,
which takes away from the actual community itself, the decadence of our society. When you have people that are part of it, that live there, they have a vested interest in its success. Police officers that police a certain community, they're looking at that and they're saying, you know what, this is where I work every day. I want to come back to this environment. We don't have that anymore. We don't have the idea that my contribution should be for the betterment of this arena or this area.
Yeah. Well, to be quite honest, the economic systems that we've set up, that police departments and other kind of social service agencies have to manage, is from a deficit model, right? So we have police agencies who say, I have to get so many arrests or tickets just to keep my staff because that's how we get funded, right? Or I have
you have an interest in the ongoing degradation of X,
and even if it's not personal, It is systemic. So if
it's to their survival. It's that organization's survival.
Yeah.
So the fact is, if in fact I need X amount of dollars, and everybody on the staff knows it, and their job is to police the community, they're not going to go forward and not write a ticket. They're going to go forward with the mindset of, if I don't write a ticket, then that contributes to the detriment of my personal survival.
Yeah, and so so lots of social service, not just policing agencies, but lots of social services operate off that deficit model, right? And so as people need us, we give more services and we can get tax dollars according to those services. And so there's a number of things that we have to deconstruct even in our local governments to change the models by which we operate.
So now, looking at specifically the recent violence that we've seen in our community, we have a shooter from Dallas who impacted an entire community, a community that I'm from originally. We have murders that have occurred in Baton Rouge, both by law enforcement against African Americans and African Americans against law enforcement. And we also have situations here in the Twin Cities area, specifically out of Falcon Heights, that has taken the life of another African American. Do you see any tie-in to your position as a racial justice advocate and the behavior engaged in by both law enforcement as well as individuals who seem to take the law into their own hands?
Yeah, well, in all of the cases that you just kind of laid out for us, there are some things that are distinctly different about those and nuances that we haven't that for African Americans, they don't seem to get the benefit of the doubt of those nuances.
Right.
And so, for example, the man who was the shooter in Dallas. In all indications, and from most professionals who study trauma and the impact of trauma, would suggest that this man actually suffered from mental illness.
Right.
And so to label this a racially motivated crime is too simple for the complexity of what that man was dealing with, right?
But don't you think at some point in time there may be a correlation to mental health and the continuous degradation of an individual or an individual's group that they belong to?
Yeah, I think you can't separate those two.
Right.
But to blame one without the consideration of the other is too simple. Right. And so typically for African Americans, examples have been, or precedents have been made off of simplistic worldviews about what African Americans can or cannot do, or would or would not do. And so in the case of a number of these public shootings where the shooter was white, mental illness is the forefront,
right.
And then the fact that he is white, and then the fact that he is male becomes secondary. But when the crime is committed by an so-called African American, the nature of why they did it is because they were black,
right?
And then all of these other things become secondary. And so black people become the rule, where white people committing the same crime become the exception.
Yeah.
And you'll see that even in how white people talk. Well, he was mentally ill, or he was different because ... I
know. I remember that was kind of the narrative that they gave in the Sandy Hook situation, where the young man that committed that atrocity, they said he was mentally ill. Very little conversation was dedicated to the fact that he was white,
right,
killing other white children. It was he was mentally ill. We should have a national conversation about gun control, when in reality the conversation that we should have had was one of mental illness.
Yeah. Well,
and that was a secondary conversation.
Yep. Mental illness, and then talking about white, because there are things that are happening with our white boys that we have to address,
right.
And we've not ever had that conversation. Right?
What is that has to be addressed with white boys or white men?
Well, first is their feeling of disenfranchisement, right? So part of it, and it seems counterproductive, but I think it's extremely accurate, right? Or it seems counterintuitive, but I think it's extremely accurate in that white men and white boys feel that they have not been heard or a part of a conversation that they have something to offer to these diversity conversations, right? And so as a result of that, I think there's a huge backlash to anything that could seem progressive, because no one's really asking them what they think or how they feel, or when they do identify what they think and how they feel, people automatically shut them down,
right.
or shut them up,
right.
without having a full conversation. And I would even go as far as to say their resentment and the nomination of Donald Trump are very much in alignment, because here is someone who has a platform, who can say what I think, even if nobody else agrees with what I say. I have a mouthpiece that can voice my opinions because no one else is listening to me.
Right.
And so oftentimes when we have diversity conversations, they're very much one-sided from the people of color's angle, and one of the things that I try to do in all of my work is to make sure that we're having an accurate and balanced account of everything that's happening. And so white people's voices need to be heard as much as the so-called minority voices. And because if we don't do that, then we continually have
a one-sided conversation.
A one-sided conversation, and we have white boys in particular acting out in some very peculiar kinds of ways.
Wow. We could go on for hours talking about this topic, but unfortunately we're out of time. Andre Koen, thank you so much for being on the show. We do appreciate you as well. Man. That wraps it up. Thank you for joining us with Ask for TR, the CBN edition. I am Ben Myers. For the record, you're not alone.